My guest on the podcast today is going to help you structure your meals so you can make healthier choices when you are eating. Joining me on the podcast today is Dr. Federica Amati. She holds a PhD in clinical medicine research from Imperial College London, has a master's in public health, and is an Association for Nutrition accredited nutritionist. She is the nutrition topic lead at Imperial College London School of Medicine and has led multiple research teams, including at the WHO Collaborating Center. She serves as a non-executive assistant director at NED-PRO Global Institute for Food, Nutrition, and Health, which is an award-winning interdisciplinary think tank. Dr. Amati works as the head nutritionist for a personalized healthcare company, which we talk about in this episode, called Zoe. She works clinically as the head of nutrition for well-funded health, and her approach is really about improving overall quality of one's diet through using personalized nutritional science, evidence-based research, and that she has practiced this in her own life. Along her research and nutritional work, she has written 2 books. They are known as the Recipes for a Better Menopause and the book Every Body Should Know This. She has so many great tips in our conversation, talking about when you are structuring a meal, what to look for, how to add in flavor, how to add in variety to the food that we eat so that we can reduce the risk of chronic disease. Please enjoy this fascinating conversation with Dr. Federica Amati. Welcome to the Health, Habits, and Epic Living podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sherry Price. The goal of this podcast is to educate and enable empowered women to take the next step towards achieving their health, wellness, and lifestyle goals. Let's get started. Dr. Federica Amati, welcome to the Health, Habits, and Epic Living podcast. Super excited to have you here. And to get us started, because you are the leading head nutritionist for Zoe, the personal healthcare company, and you've written books on nutrition and really versed in this area. And by the way, I love watching your content. I'd like to get us started off with the research around diet and nutrition, particularly my podcast audience for women, right, in that perimenopause, menopause area. What tips do you have regarding how we should be looking at our nutrition and serving our bodies during this transitional time and into menopause?
Well, thanks for having me, Sherry, and thank you for that question. I think we're in a really interesting, pivotal moment for nutrition science and nutrition research as it refers to women's health and specifically to menopause. So we at Zoe have done some really big nutrition research looking at how diet affects menopause and how we can actually help to improve menopausal symptoms and improve that journey through midlife with food. So the power of food for women in this time of life is huge. And part of the work that we're doing is to really spread this news and to give women the agency and the power back to help themselves feel better now, reduce their symptom severity, the number of symptoms they have, but also look after their health for the long term. So it's really this amazing message that the food that you choose to eat every day can really directly impact how you're going to navigate this time of life and have such a beneficial effect for the long term for your future you as well.
Yeah, and I believe I saw some content on your Instagram feed, which, by the way, is amazing. And I love how you give practical tips. You were looking at recommending some nutrition coming from food sources that is going to help alleviate some of those symptoms. Can you tell us a little bit more and dive into that?
Yes, for sure. So what we have found in our research, which we started back in 2020, so we started really diving deep because we saw some initial signals. So Professor Sarah Berry, who's a chief scientist, saw some initial signals of change and of effect of diet on menopause. And so she dove deeper and deeper. And what's really clear is that a diet that is rich in plants. Now, this doesn't mean you have to be vegan or vegetarian or fully plant-based. It just means having a variety of plants in your diet really supports health at this time of life. And when we're thinking about, okay, well, what does that mean? What do you mean support health? Well, we know that women going through menopause have worse metabolic responses. So when we look at women's postprandial response, so how their blood sugar and blood fats change directly after a meal, we know that that change in blood sugar and blood fat, and actually in some inflammatory markers, is very different between women who are premenopausal, perimenopausal, and postmenopausal. So what does that mean? Well, it means that literally the way that our body processes food changes, our metabolism changes. And knowing that also means that we can help women to choose the foods that are less likely to cause these more inflammatory responses. So higher blood glucose, higher blood fat that persists, having high triglycerides or blood fats for many hours after you eat is pro-inflammatory. It's not helpful for us or for cardiovascular health. So how can we help women to eat foods that don't do that? And as you can probably guess, plant foods, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, beans, legumes, pulses, all of these foods help to reduce that. These are foods that when we eat them, they're very high in fiber. Many of them are high in fiber and in plant protein. Mm-hmm. And the distinction between plant protein and animal protein is becoming, stronger every year. So there's more and more research that's coming out that tells us that plant protein is more beneficial for health consumed in high amounts compared to consuming high amounts of animal protein. So we can get this beautiful package of a high protein, high fiber, high polyphenol. So polyphenols are these antioxidant chemicals in foods, but all packaged into beautiful plants. And so it's, when you think about it that way, it's no surprise that we see this very clear relationship between a high plant intake and reduced symptom burden. So across the board, whether it's with mood or with weight gain or with risk of metabolic health, it's all improved by having this higher intake of plants. So some of the advice that I give on a practical level, it's literally adding leafy greens to your day every day. So, eat your greens is as old as time. We've been told to eat our greens forever, but actually doing it. So, so making sure that we're incorporating greens every day, and not in a green juice, the whole green with all the fiber, eating that every day, incorporating legumes, incorporating whole grains. Many of us eat no whole grains whatsoever because we've become so accustomed to eating refined carbohydrates and refined grains in terms of flours and white rice and, pasta, that actually we don't buy buckwheat and barley and spelt and use that in our cooking anymore. So bring those back. And then there's also research that really supports these very polyphenol rich foods. So blueberries, blackberries, extra virgin olive oil, they also act to alleviate symptoms. So altogether, the picture that I'm painting really is a Mediterranean diet with one addition, I should say, which is, these soy-based foods. So soy-based foods like edamame or tofu or soy milk contain specific kinds of chemicals that help that journey through menopause. So when we look at countries that consume very high amounts of tofu and very high amounts of soy products, they report having far fewer symptoms. So soy isoflavones, sometimes they're also called phytoestrogens. I just want to make super clear that they don't act on our body in the same way that estrogen does, but they are beneficial for maintaining, for reducing symptom severity and symptom burden. So unless you're allergic, having soy products in the diet, and then a diet that's really rich in plants and really rich in colorful fruits and berries, extra virgin olive oil, is really going to help to stand you in good stead through this time.
All right. So I heard lots of plants, right?
Yes.
Get your vegetables, beans, legumes, fruit. So when we're talking about a plant-rich diet or a plant-enriched diet, how many servings would you say that comes down to? And what are the symptoms specifically that you saw in the research that are alleviated through a heavier plant-based diet rich in fiber?
So the way that we looked at this, we actually created a new symptom score. It is called the Meno scale, and it is available. You could go to zoe.com/menopause and you'll see it there. You can type in your symptoms and it will give you, literally calculate a score of where you are on the Meno scale. So we developed this as part of the research to try and better understand what symptom severity there is, what symptom burden there is, and how long does it persist? Because, post-menopause is a very big bracket. So post-menopause for some women can be 40 years, 50 years. So how do we actually find out how long the symptom burden goes on for? And using this scale, we saw a reduction in symptom severity and symptom burden of 30% across the board. So different women present with different symptoms and different symptom severity. What we're trying to see, there's a more detailed breakdown of exactly which symptoms are more likely across different groups and age groups. So one of the things that we saw a lot of is that weight gain is the number one cited perimenopausal symptom that women find most bothersome. And we can reduce the risk of that with this very plant-rich diet and maintain a healthy weight. So that's just one example. There are other symptoms that we looked at are emotional symptoms, hot flashes, chills, night sweats, all these sort of also improve. So it's a really exciting time to be able to really understand how diet can impact these symptoms and by what scale it can be impacted. So, having such a big reduction in symptom burden with something that everybody can do in their homes is really exciting. It's something that feels like such a relief because so many women do at this time feel like they have nothing they can do themselves to help themselves feel better. And I guess we're here to say that there is something you can definitely do, and it sits in your cupboard, it sits in your fridge, and you can do something about it. And you can start as early as you like. You can look at this as a prevention tool. So how can we go into perimenopause well armed with the knowledge that a high fiber, high plant diet is going to help? But you can also use it wherever you are in the journey. So you might be postmenopausal, but you're still suffering symptoms and you want to feel better, and it will help you then too. So there's no time limit on this kind of intervention. And it's exciting to see the impact it has across the board with all the symptoms.
Yeah, that's exciting. And we love to implement healthy habits on this podcast for sure. So I know you guys do personalized nutrition. So when I'm personalizing it to making the breakfast, the lunch, or the dinner, can you give us any tips about how to think about putting together and structuring that meal?
Yeah, so I like to think exactly as you said. I like to think about the plate. So you have your plate and you're about to make yourself whatever meal it is. The goal is to have 50% of that plate made up by plants. And I want to remind your listeners here that, we're talking about nuts and seeds, legumes, whole grains, spices and herbs, and fruits and veg. So there's so many foods to choose from, because often when people think half my plate needs to be plant, oh my gosh, I don't want half my plate to be salad. But it's not just salad. Love salad, by the way, nothing wrong with salad, but it's such a variety of foods with different textures and flavors. So really get involved with that. In terms of portion size, I think sometimes portion sizing can be really prescriptive. So it's not really about the portion size. It's more about what we find is really helpful for our community is, can you get to 30 plants per week? So can you make it your sort of bingo card to get 30 different plants a week? And again, that includes garlic and onion, spices and herbs, include lots of foods. But that really helps to get creative with what are we adding to our plate that's going to help us to get to half our plate being plants in a way that's really flavorful and interesting. There are some things that we can think of in terms of portion size. And honestly, for me, like the simplest way to do this is a palm size amount. So a palm size amount of nuts and seeds, palm size amount of whole grains, palm size amount of most things will amount to a portion, apart from things like spinach, which is a palm size amount of raw spinach leaves is about this much spinach. But when we're thinking about these foods that you can put in your palm, that is a good place to start. Similarly, if you're having like a portion of oily fish, or perhaps you're having a piece of red meat, which we would recommend having more occasionally as opposed to daily. But you could think of a palm size as a good starting point for a portion size. And then once you get used to eating in this way with half of the plate is plants, then another quarter of the plate is your chosen source of protein and healthy fat. So that might be oily fish, but it might also be that you choose to have tofu. It might be tempeh. It might be other sources of protein. And then the sort of last quarter of the plate is where we look at carbohydrates. So ideally, these would be whole grains. So the barley, the buckwheat, the spelt. But of course, there's always space for pasta. I'm Italian. There's always space for pasta. There's always space for having some delicious rye bread. When we're talking about carbohydrates, the quality and fiber content is so important. So it always is just about choosing what's, the best available to you for that. And so if we think of that plate composition, we're using extra virgin olive oil as our primary source of fats. We cook with it, we dress our food with it. And if extra virgin olive oil is not something you can afford right now, because let's be honest, the global prices are crazy, then just the virgin olive oil is fine. It still has plenty of polyphenols as well. And then remembering that really our main drink should be water, green tea or herbal teas, and coffee if you tolerate it. If you don't tolerate caffeine, decaf coffee is just as good for us. And really stay away from drinking sodas, sweetened drinks. Frankly, there's so many on the market that it's not even the obvious ones anymore. There's other brands that have appeared that sell themselves as healthy, but they're still essentially sugar sweetened beverages. So really, really avoiding those. They should not be part of our regular diet.
Yeah, I like that you highlighted what we drink matters. And we're going to come back to talking about alcohol could be in that glass too, if it's around dinner time. But we're going to put a pin on that for now. I do want to go down and ask your thoughts about meat, and particularly red meat, because you said a little bit of red meat. And so I know there's a lot of research coming out that protein is needed as a stimulus for building muscle synthesis and building muscles, particularly as we decline more and more in terms of our skeletal muscle mass as we go through perimenopause and into menopause. So what are your thoughts around meat as being, red meat particularly, as being building up our strength, and is that needed?
I think this is probably the topic that has the strongest factions in nutrition at the moment. So I am not an absolutist either way. So I want to make that super clear. We absolutely do. Protein is an essential part of our diet, and we absolutely do need it. As we age, our ability to absorb protein and to build muscle decreases. Just eating lots more protein isn't going to offer this enough stimulus to maintain that muscle mass. By far, the biggest factor is moving your body. So actually giving that muscle a reason to need to continue to exist is by far the biggest thing. So if we take a step back and we look at, my background is in public health. So looking at population data, I always feel and find that it gives us a lot of information around what our goal is, right? So if our goal is to look at populations that have longevity and very low chronic disease risk. So these are populations that live well into their 90s, and they report very low levels of type 2 diabetes, low levels of cancer. So for me, in my practice and in my research, that's what I've been interested in. So finding what nutrition, what patterns of nutrition help us to achieve that. So functional independence. So I would love to be able to get out of bed by myself, take a shower by myself, take the stairs well into my 80s and 90s. That's the goal. Then the evidence is pretty clear that having a diet that's high in plant protein, and we're looking at, an intake of 1 gram or 1.2 grams per kilogram. So not a huge amount of protein needed. And crucially, these are populations that don't track their macros, really. So they eat a variety of whole foods, and they're very physically active. They walk up and down stairs, up and down hills. They do gardening. They grow their own veg. So they're physically extremely active and socially active. So for me personally, that's my goal. I would like to be a sprightly 80-something-year-old grandma who can jump around with her grandkids, okay? Now, if that's your goal, then the evidence is pretty irrefutable that the majority of the population in the UK and the US are definitely getting enough protein just by eating food, because most of us eat too much food, and most food contains protein. So none of us are protein deficient. Protein deficiency clinically is extremely rare, apart from in people who suffer with eating disorders, who suffer with cancer cachexia. So that's a loss of muscle mass and weight following cancer treatment. And the elderly who are frail and who live in care homes where they have reduced mobility. So if you're in one of those three groups, then there is a definite need for support in understanding how protein requirements have changed and how you will probably need to actually increase your protein intake. But the majority of us, thankfully, are not in those groups. So then when we look to other groups who, for example, want to build a lot of muscle mass quickly, so we're talking bodybuilders, weightlifters, professional athletes who compete in these sports, or or even if they're not competing, if that's what their goal is, then you have a different approach. So in those cases, you may well have an increased protein need. And that is also because you are training 3 or 4 hours a day. You're causing a lot of muscle damage, and there's a lot of protein requirement from your body, both in the inflammatory response to the damage, actually, and also building the muscle. So for me, it's like the question around how much protein do we need and should we be worried? Well, it depends what your goal is, and it depends who you are and what your background is. As a general rule for the population, protein deficiency is not a major issue. And the problem with pushing protein so hard is that we are sort of getting rid of the focus on other parts of our diet that are incredibly important for our health. So now red meat is one of these sources of protein, and red meat is incredibly nutrient dense. It is high in not just protein, but in iron and B12 and zinc. It contains a lot of essential micronutrients and nutrients that are very good for us. Do we need to eat a lot of it? No. So it's extremely bioavailable in red meat. So having a piece of red meat every 10 days will really help to bolster your levels of all of these nutrients. Now, if you're a patient of mine and you come to me and you say, I have really quite low iron at the moment, what can I do to just get my levels back up without supplementing? Supplementing can be really quite bothersome for the stomach when you supplement for that. Okay, great. Well, but for a couple of weeks, eat red meat more regularly. Whoop, straight back up. Okay, and then go back to maintenance. So the point about red meat is why not eat every day? Well, there's a few things to consider, Sherry. Like the first thing to consider is that in terms of health, there is lots of evidence and lots of data to show that people who consume a lot of red meat, so daily and, or more, I think some of the data is actually just 3 times a week or more, or 4 times a week or more, are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease, more likely to develop certain types of cancer. Now, I really want to be super clear here, though, that it is processed meat that is a carcinogen. So eating processed meat is causative of colon cancer, whereas eating red meat increases risk, but it's not a carcinogen in itself. So it's not considered a class 1 carcinogen. I don't want to scare people. If you like eating red meat and it's part of your diet, I would just consider the fact that you don't need to eat it that regularly, and it might actually be detrimental to your health to eat it too regularly. The second thing to think about is, what is that red meat displacing from your plate? So often a big portion of red meat is really filling, right? You will feel pretty full. So what is it that you're not eating because you've just had this massive steak? And if you're having that 4 times a week, what is missing from your diet for that week? And most of the time, it will be fiber-rich foods. It'll be foods that are high in fiber, foods that contain helpful polyphenols, and frankly, foods that contain healthier polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. Red meat is a saturated fat food. So we're displacing all these nutrients when you're having a lot of it. And then the third thing to think about is the impact it has on the animal and the environment. Now, a lot of people, if that's not something they consider when they make food choices, and that's absolutely fine. But if it is something that you are concerned about, red meat is by far and away the most environmentally detrimental protein source. So whilst regenerative agriculture and buying your meat from really good farmers is really great, so I don't think that living in a world where there is no farming would be helpful, but it's really about the quality. So my recommendations are to buy red meat occasionally as a really wonderful treat. So maybe you're having it once a week or once a fortnight, and to focus on buying the best quality red meat that you can, which is more respectful to the animal and to the environment. So, and gives you all the benefits of eating that red meat. Now, full disclosure, I don't eat red meat. I haven't for many years. You don't need it in your diet to have a good nutritional status. My children eat it. My husband eats it occasionally. I will buy it for them from like my really trusted butcher who has brilliant meat. But for me personally, it doesn't work. So if you don't eat it, that's absolutely fine. If you do eat it, being mindful of quality and how frequently you're eating it is really worthwhile.
Yeah. Good quality. I hands down believe, right? Grass fed, grass finished, regenerative farming practices. So important, I know, in my decision when selecting meats. So you mentioned again fiber, and this is something that I don't know gets enough attention. I actually learned about it later in life and realized like the average, I think, female in the United States only gets like 11 grams of fiber.
Yeah.
And that is clearly not enough. Can you dive into a little bit more about fiber and what food sources we can find it in?
Yes, I'm so happy you asked this question because you're exactly right. So fiber, the great deficiency of our time is fiber. We, on average in the US, the UK is bad and the US is slightly worse. So more than 90% of adults in the UK and the US don't reach the minimum dietary requirement for fiber. So the daily recommended amount, which is 30 grams per day. In the US, as you said, like it can be as low as 11 grams per day, which is completely far off the 30 gram mark. And that number gets worse with age. So as adults get older, they actually eat less and less fiber. So it's even worse. Now, what's really interesting about this is that, so this is what I was saying about fixating on protein displaces the actual need we have to increase our fiber. And there are plenty of fiber-rich, protein-rich foods, which could tick both of the boxes, right? Now, why is it important? So who cares? Like, who cares if I have a low-fiber diet? Well, first of all, anyone who has followed a low-fiber diet or has had a low-fiber diet will know that the digestive health that comes with that is not great. So bloating, constipation, frankly, uncomfortable, painful bowel habits, that is part and parcel of a low-fiber diet. And those are sort of the physical, tangible things. But when we also look to the impact it has on mental health, the impact it has on cardiovascular health is huge. So each 5 gram increase, an incremental 5 gram per day increase, reduces your risk of overall mortality from everything by 14%, which is huge, right? So that was one of the big studies that really looked at why do we need to increase it. Other studies have looked at the relationship between fiber intake and the outcomes like depression, outcomes like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancers. And there is a very clear relationship, a very clear, direct causal effect of increasing fiber and decreasing risk. So increasing your fiber intake every day is one of the simplest ways that we can improve our health across the board, whether that be, and so the mental health aspect, just in case someone's wondering, like, how does that work? Is, the gut-brain axis is incredibly powerful.
Yes.
High-fiber dietary interventions that have been done with people with severe mental health disorders are amazing. The results are wonderful. You see this absolute reduction in symptom severity, even with people who have drug-resistant severe depression. So having a high-fiber diet supports a healthy gut microbiome, which is the trillions of microbes that live inside our gut. We feed them, they produce these chemicals for us that travel and communicate with and travel to the vagus nerve, giving our brain signals about what's happening and essentially altering our mood. And a lot of this interplay happens through inflammation as well. So the gut microbiome helps to modulate the inflammatory response from the immune system, and that is also directly linked to mood. So it's so crucial. It's so important. It has so many tangible benefits. There's also things like, some of my patients are like, oh my gosh, my skin is so much better. And actually just seeing that can really help as well. So it's not spoken about enough. It's something that myself and my, Professor Tim Spector, who is the co-founder of Zoe, we have been talking about this for years, trying to get people to really understand how important fiber is and how easy it is to include. So how do we do it? Well, increasing plant-based foods is a very simple way to increase your fiber, but you're right. There's certain foods that have a higher fiber content than others. So whereas an apple has roughly 2 grams of fiber, which is not a lot, but apples are wonderful, keep eating them. When we look at half a cup of lentils, that has 18 grams. So legumes, pulses, beans have higher fiber, but then so do things like blackberries. So raspberries, blackberries. So getting a variety of plants helps you to reach that 30 grams per day. And instead of necessarily trying to calculate exactly how much you've had, I think just aim to have a variety and aim to include these whole grains and these legumes because they're really fiber rich. And this is a good time to also say like nuts and seeds. They have been demonized for many years. Nuts and seeds are amazing. They're high in fiber. They're high in plant protein. They're high in healthy fats. They are so good for us. So including those in your diet is really helpful, unless of course you're allergic. But if you have a nut allergy, including seeds is still really valuable. I think hopefully that helps to frame that it's actually fairly easy to increase your fiber intake. So start slow, incorporate these foods a little bit at a time. I have worked with people in the past who have said, yeah, great, I'll do it. And then they went from eating hardly any fiber to eating a full 3-bean stew. Don't do that because you'll be pretty gassy. So take it easy, let your gut microbes adjust, and then enjoy the flavors, enjoy the experience of adding these foods into your diet and see how it makes you feel. The effects are pretty rapid. Like you'll feel better quickly and you will be banking on your future health in such a big way that it's just going to be so worthwhile.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting the data on that. And we just had lentils as a family last night. I was talking about at dinner, the benefits and the fiber that we're getting. And oftentimes, when I'm working with people in my Tone in 10 program, we're calculating our fiber because it is important. And I get a greater sense of satiety, fullness, right? It really reduces sugar cravings for me. And I think it is something that, if you pay a little bit of attention to it as you're making the change, and then you become accustomed to these foods, you don't necessarily have to track them, like you said. They just become part of a healthy diet for you. And when you start feeling better, that is the best positive motivator to keep going, right? I think a lot of people think of nutrition and diet as punishing and restrictive and deprivation, and we're going to feel worse before we feel better. You're right. If we overdo fiber, yes, I'm with you. I've overdone that, and it does make me particularly very gassy. So not good for the workplace. But yes, taking it slow and steady and really looking at it as like, this is a change I'm making for my health and something that I can learn to adjust, learn to pivot, learn to adapt these lifestyle practices into our health. And then we find that like blood pressure comes down, blood chemistry, our triglycerides start to come down. Like it makes a significant impact. We don't think that these small dietary changes are going to make these impact on our lab values, but we see that they do just as impressively, if not sometimes more impressively than the pharmaceutical agents that are out there that can be used.
Without a doubt. So we know like from good comparison data that if you do the dietary intervention that is needed for reducing blood pressure, you get better results than taking blood pressure meds.
Yeah.
Now, this is not to say that medication has a place and everybody should absolutely stick to their meds, but do the change alongside it and make that, because medication is there to help us where there's a malfunction or where something isn't working as it should. But the food we eat is fueling that system. So making that change to improve what we feed our bodies every day actually very often absolutely solves for the underlying problem. And you find that you need the medication as much, you may be, or you might not need to go on it in the first place, which is really, I hope that's what we hope for is prevention. And, what's really interesting is that, so I don't know if you've tried Zoe, Sherry, but when you get your Zoe results, you have a personalized plan and you get told to slowly change one thing at a time, incrementally increase your fiber. And there's a really clear way to do this that brings so much joy and flavor and enjoyment to the whole process. So one of the things that I think really differentiates this approach is what I call that's not just me, but it's called positive nutrition. And it's actually this idea of like, what do we need to add back into our diets that's going to support our health and our goals, as opposed to focusing on what we need to take out. And Zoe is built on that principle. So the advice we give is, okay, add more of this into your diet, put more of this onto your plate, And of course, what happens is that if you are adding these delicious foods onto your plate, it displaces the other things that we don't want so much of anyway, because that's the way humans work. If you tell them to eat less cake, they'll be like, oh man, I was going to have cake today. But actually, if you're encouraging people to eat foods that will help them feel satiated, and the science on satiety, the power of protein and fiber have different ways of causing satiety signaling. So the protein acts higher up in the gut. Satiety signaling is really as a result of that protein absorption in the small intestine. Whereas with fiber, satiety signaling comes from the colon, from the large intestine. So when you have these high fiber, high protein foods like lentils, you get a double whammy of signaling of, great, I've had nourishing food, I'm full up, I'm good. And, we're obsessed with this idea of like reducing hunger, and there's all these drugs that are out now, which are being used by people who frankly don't medically need them. We need to get in front of that and say, you can get to this place where you can maintain a healthy weight or achieve the weight that you want without the need for medication, because we have very good satiety signaling that's built within us. So it's a message that we definitely want to see more of. And if you're somebody who is taking those medications for medical reasons and you aren't eligible, then actually supporting yourself with diet is so important, because your overall health will improve with the reduced amount of food you're eating if that food is exactly what your body needs.
Yeah, wonderfully said. And I think it takes just a cultural shift to get back into knowing our food, understanding where it comes from, understanding the benefits it gives our body. I think food is sometimes an aftermath or something we don't want to think about, but really turning the attention and the focus on that, because that is providing a signaling pathway for our hormones, for, things going on inside of our system, which is where I actually want to talk next, is this microbiome. I've had some experts to come on and talk about that gut-brain connection that you alluded to, that you mentioned, like once you start cleaning up your gut, feeding your gut the right nutrition, giving it enough fiber, you notice like mentally, the brain fog is gone or the depression starts to ease. And it's such a powerful tool for us to really look at this microbiome and how it is affected, because you're right, over 90% of our serotonin is made in our gut. And if we're not making it, it's not going to travel up the vagus nerve, like you said, into the brain. It's not going to get into the brain if we're not making it. 70% of our immune system made in the gut, right? The gut is a resource of generation of a lot of these important signaling molecules and pathways. And I do want to dovetail into like how alcohol impacts the gut, because I think we think about alcohol in our liver, alcohol in our brain. We know it can lead to earlier dementia. We know, but
more people need to know that though. But yeah, go. You can repeat that.
Yes, it leads to earlier dementia. Nobody wants to lose their cognitive abilities earlier. So can you mention how the alcohol really affects what's going on in the gut and this downstream effects of that and symptoms?
Yeah, so the research we have on alcohol is interesting because it's essentially pro-inflammatory. So when it reaches the gut, it causes inflammation the whole way down. So it's also why, so alcohol alongside processed meats that we spoke about earlier is one of the very few things that we ingest that are actually classed as class 1 carcinogens. So when we look at the WHO's list of all the things that are classed as direct carcinogens, class 1, the majority of them are actually environmental exposures. There's only a handful of foods, right? It's processed meat, alcohol, we ingest it, cocktail nut, Chinese saltfish, which is quite rare to find now. So alcohol on its way down, everything it touches on the way, it inflames. And that is part of why it's a carcinogen. So that is also why if you're somebody who drinks regularly or a heavy drinker, you're more at risk of all of the GI tract cancers. So esophageal, mouth, stomach, and colon. So let's start with that. That's clearly it's not helpful for our gut. Now, what it does at a microbiome level is that it causes more dysbiosis. So it disrupts the balance of the helpful microbes that live in our gut and tips the balance more towards the pro-inflammatory microbes that thrive in a more inflamed environment. So the only caveat here is to say is that there is like a difference in the types of alcohol. So if you're having a red wine with a low alcohol content, then that damage is going to be slightly reduced because the red wine polyphenols are actually helpful for the gut. So if we think of that as like a little bit of a tipping balance, it's still alcohol, but it's better to drink that on occasion than to drink tequila salads. Nothing wrong with tequila, but just to give an example. So choosing what we're drinking is important, but being cognizant of the fact that, yes, this has this inflammatory effect all the way down. And over time, if you are consuming alcohol very regularly, you are not giving your gut a break from readdressing that dysbiosis and actually giving the good guys, the good microbes, time to recover and get back to producing all the helpful chemicals that we want them to produce for us, and making sure that our gut barrier is intact and protecting us from infections or from, what's sometimes termed leaky gut. I hate that term, but when our gut barrier is compromised, things like proteins and chemicals and matter that's inside our gut crosses over out of our gut into what you mentioned earlier, the immune system tissues that lie just outside. And when the immune system picks up on these foreign bodies crossing the barrier, of course, it mounts an inflammatory response. So we want to protect that barrier at all costs and keep it healthy and thriving and intact. And if we're drinking alcohol very regularly, especially if we're drinking alcohol, more than one small glass is really what we're trying to get, it will impact your gut health. And if you're somebody who has a problem with their relationship with alcohol and has issues with just sticking to that one glass, then it really is worth addressing that as early as possible, because as well as the effects on the brain, as well as the effects on the rest of the body, the liver, you're damaging your body in a way that is fully preventable by just not drinking it. So alcohol is one of these funny risk factors that is acceptable in society despite the harm it does, which is another issue for another day. But we have the control to just not let it be a risk factor, because you don't have to drink alcohol to survive, right? So whereas navigating food can be tricky because we need to eat to survive, but it can be tricky to know what's best for us. With alcohol, it's pretty straightforward that if it's not something you can have a balanced relationship with, you're best off having none. So, and yeah, there is this really clear correlation with the amount of alcohol drunk and the inflammation in the gut. And as we just touched on, the gut-brain connection is so important. The gut-brain axis is so important. So if we're not supporting that, then down the pathway, this regular alcohol drinking is also going to impact your mood indirectly through the gut-brain axis. So it's not a pretty picture. Again, not to say I drink alcohol. I drink very occasionally. I have a glass of red wine with a meal with friends. That's how I've always had this sort of relationship with it. But in the same breath, I work with a lot of people who don't have a good relationship with it. And it's just, don't drink it. And it's much easier not to drink nowadays than it used to be, I think. There's a lot of options. There's lots of levels of damage it can do. And the gut is 100% in there. And I think that what we talked about at the beginning, the fact that it directly increases colon cancer risk, is the almost obvious way to describe that impact.
Absolutely. Yeah, the risk in increasing a lot of different types of cancers, as you pointed out. And, we are swimming in a culture that thinks and gets a hall pass when it comes to alcohol. It's like, it's not even looked at as a drug, right? It's not even thought of as this harmful substance. Because we joke, we laugh, we get numb, we just think it's a way to reward, relax, and unwind. But really, when we get serious about our health, when we really want to protect our brain, when we really want to reduce the risk of cancer, when we really see the symptoms that we feel that are cognitive, right? Like the next day, the reason you feel anxious, depressed, can't sleep, right? That's all the neurotransmitters and, how it changes melatonin and our ability to fall asleep. Some people are like, I need this as a sleep aid. Well, that's because you've trained your body to need it as a sleep aid, and your body will readjust and come back to homeostasis once that drug is removed. So we do see the metabolic effects. We do see the cognitive effects. We do see the, effects on the liver and how it makes our livers fat and less able to process and grab the nutrients from our food, right? So many downstream effects that I don't think it gets the attention that it needs. So thank you for highlighting how
and Sherry, you're so right. When we're thinking about menopausal women as well, and women in midlife, it's funny. A lot of women become quite intolerant to alcohol around this time.
Yes.
And it's like the body's self-defense mechanism is like, stop that. So I think listening to our bodies, and as we age, alcohol is such a huge risk factor in older age. When we look at people that are displaying signs of cognitive decline, there's amazing stories of where that person's just been told to stop drinking and it has transformed their quality of life and their cognitive decline is gone. So it's something that it needs to be kept. We need to keep an eye on it, be aware of it, be aware of what it does. Then everyone can make their choice. But exactly as you said, bringing awareness to what it is. It is a carcinogenic neurotoxin, right? At its heart. And if you're trying to conceive or pregnant, it's a carcinogenic neurotoxin and it's a teratogen, which means that it directly causes changes to embryonic structure, so development. Now, if you know that, then I think it helps to make decisions about whether you're going to drink, how much, and when in your life you're going to drink. And if your body is clearly rejecting it, let's listen to our bodies as well.
Right. And I love bringing the education and the awareness around that and not making it stigmatizing or shameful, right? It's just, spreading the proper education around this drug. Well, Dr. Federica, it's been awesome having you on the podcast. Thanks for your time and sharing your knowledge. And I really enjoy your Instagram channel. So please tell my listeners where they can find you and your books and all the information when they want to learn more about you.
Well, you can find out more. I have a website, federicaamati.com. My Instagram handles are all Dr. Fede Amati, so you can find me across all of the channels. And my latest book is called Everybody Should Know This. And my first book is actually Recipes for a Better Menopause. So that's got a lot of the science that we've discussed and some really delicious recipes that were created by a wonderful chef called Jane Baxter. So both of those books are available on Amazon. You can find them across the different booksellers. Yeah.
Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for these resources. And again, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Health Habits and Epic Living podcast. If you're ready to take the next step to improve your health, wellness, and lifestyle goals, head over to www.epicyou.com and sign up for my weekly newsletter. Again, that's EPICYOU.com. Please note that the information in this podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice.